In this video we would like to compare all the anti-tank launchers of the engineer class, that is the Mbt Law, Javelin, SMAW, SRAW and RPG. Let's have a look at the Mbt Law first. Since this one fires self-guiding missiles, it will always hit the tank on top and do 21 damage. Since the Mbt Law finds its target automatically, its tolerance for fail shots is relatively high, so you can actually miss your target by several meters, but it will always do a curve and still hit the tank, and therefore it's very hard to actually dodge shots that are coming from Mbt Law launchers. On top of that, the Mbt Law can lock onto laser designated targets, and therefore it is quite effective against airborne targets as well. When hitting a laser designated heli, it will deal 37 damage, which is the same value that it will do when hitting it directly without laser designation. If you take a look at the missile's trajectory, you will realize that it's, at least at this point in the game, absolutely flat, which therefore allows you to engage targets at extreme range, theoretically without range limitation at all. One of the main advantages of the Mbt Law is that you can actually shoot around corners with it, and therefore you're not forced to expose yourself to the enemy tank or whatever vehicle it is that you're engaging. How this exactly works and how you can abuse that, at least at this point in the game, we will show in a later commentary. Now let's go one step further and take a look at the Javelin. This one, even without laser locks, does constantly 25 damage to both APCs and tanks. A major disadvantage of the Javelin is that you have to manually hold the lock to have the missile actually hit its target. As soon as you stop holding the lock, the missile will disengage and don't do any damage at all. This hold lock system can be overcome by a laser designation though. If you're locking onto a laser designated target, the Javelin becomes a fire and forget weapon. With that laser lock, it will do a top-down attack and do 50 damage. With the double shot trick that we already showed in our Stinger and Igla quick tip video, you can deal up to 50 damage with the Javelin without laser locks. Including the laser designation, the Javelin can deal up to 91 damage to an attack heli. The next weapon that we're going to look at right now is the SRAW. The amount of damage that it causes to tanks is dependent on the angle and on its hit zone. Shooting in the front armor, a 90-degree shot will deal 22 damage. When hitting the side of the tank with a 90-degree angle will do 37 damage, and a shot into the back armor does whopping 50 damage. When hitting the turret from on top with a 80 to 90-degree angle, up to 52 damage points are possible. The flatter your angle towards the target hit zone, the less damage of course you will do, so 45 degrees in the front will do 19 and in the side up to 21 damage. A 45-degree shot into the back armor will deal up to 21, but hitting the turret from on top will deal up to 34 damage. The SRAW is an instant one-shot kill against scout or attack helicopters, and this goes without laser designation. Since the SRAW is a wire-guided missile, you can easily hit moving tanks, even at very long ranges. Also, slow-moving targets like the AC-130 or hovering helicopters are simply easy prey for an SRAW shooter. On top of that, the SRAW can even lock onto laser-designated targets. For example, it can do 91 damage to an attack helicopter like that. Interestingly, and just like with Javelins or Iglas, you can do the double shot trick with the SRAW. If you are certain that your target won't be moving much in the next few seconds, you can simply stop aiming down sights for him, reload your next shot and then aim down sights again and fire your second shot. This will allow you to basically do twice the amount of damage and also save you some time that you would have normally spent being ADS. The range of the SRAW, or the length of its wire, is limited to 830 meters. Now let's take a look at the SMAW. Just like the SRAW, it does damage dependent on the angle and on the hit zone. So a 90-degree shot into the front armor of a tank does 21 damage. A 90-degree shot into the side armor will deal 31 damage, and a 90-degree shot in the back armor will deal up to 48 damage. Hitting the turret from on top with a 90-degree angle can cause up to 49 damage. If you can only get a 45-degree shot on the enemy tank, you will of course deal less damage. Hitting the front will deal up to 21 damage, hitting the side or the rear armor can deal up to 19 damage, and hitting the tank from on top can deal up to 18 damage. The biggest advantage that the SMAW has over all the other launchers is its extremely flat missile trajectory. This means that it's extremely easy to hit targets at very long ranges. Against attack helis, the SMAW deals 100 damage. It means that's an instant kill, and therefore it's extremely advisable to use that one if a airborne target is circling around you at close range. A prime example would be shooting down the scout heli on the skyscraper of Siege of Shanghai. Now let's talk about the hardest to use but also one of the very most effective anti-tank launchers in Battlefield 4, the RPG. Hardest to use because the RPG, when comparing it to all the other launchers in BF4, has the highest amount of drop that you have to compensate for. Just like with the SMAW or SRAW, the damage being dealt by the RPG is dependent on the angle and on the hit zone. A 90-degree shot into the front armor will do 23 damage. A shot in the side with a 90-degree angle will cause up to 35 damage points, and hitting a tank in the back armor will cause 55 damage points. As was to be expected, 45-degree angles will reduce the amount of damage that you deal to the enemy tank. Hitting a front armor with 45 degrees will cause 19 damage. Hitting the side or the rear will cause 22 damage each. Against airborne targets like the scout or attack heli and against all jets, the RPG is always a guaranteed one-shot kill, assuming you hit your shot, of course. Now let's look at some practical situations and think about what kind of launcher is applicable for what kind of situation here. In a very close combat situation where the enemy tank is 10 meters or so away, the highest damage output you will ever get is using RPG or SRAW, not aiming down sights of course. The RPG in this case has a 2-second longer reload time but also deals more damage than the SRAW. If the tank is making good use of cover, you might think about using the SMAW instead, since you don't have to compensate for the bullet drop as much. You might also consider using an Mbt Law when the tank is making good use of cover, because this will always result in a guaranteed, even when the tank is in a spot where he himself can't even see the RPG or SRAW shooter. Comparing to the SRAW, here you would maybe want to correct the flight path of your missile, which would simply increase the time that you're exposing yourself to the tank and therefore endangering you. Since the wonderful Mbt Law is self-guiding, you only have to expose yourself for a fraction of a second and can always count on dealing constant 21 damage to the tank. Looking at longer engagement distances, like 50 meters or so, the Mbt Law is even more useful because good tankers might be able to dodge SMAWs and RPGs at that distance, but the Mbt Law, being self-guiding, will always track the target. Of course, RPG shooters will most likely be able to hit a shot here and there. Good tankers will be able to dodge every, let's say, second shot or so you can look at the damage effectively being reduced by 50%. At those ranges, of course, you can simply use an SRAW and correct the flight path of the missile when the tank is trying to dodge, which, as I said earlier, on the other hand increases the time you are exposing yourself. At that distance and against relatively bad tankers, you can also start using Javelins. According to my experience, the typical distance that you're fighting tanks at is 50 to 100 meters. Usually at those distances, tankers can easily dodge shots from RPGs and SMAWs. Comparing that with the Mbt Law, you will not end up with a guaranteed hit at all times, but since the missile, as we already stated a few times, is self-guiding, the shot is quite likely to hit. At those ranges, you might also think about exchanging the SMAW or RPG for a Javelin, because if you're using good cover and head glitch a lot, you will make it increasingly difficult for tankers to shoot back at you. Of course, good tankers will do that, but bad to mediocre players will reach their limitations here. Looking at the 50 to 100 meter range, we would always advise you to use the SRAW. Even though you're exposing yourself, you will most likely always get a hit. On top of that, vehicle drivers can't use IR smoke or smoke screen to defend themselves against it. At 200 meter plus, a tank can most effectively be engaged with the SRAW or Javelin. The main disadvantage of the Javelin is that the tank only has to drive behind some form of cover, and then the lock-on is interrupted and Javelin will disengage. On top of that, the tanker will see where the shot is coming from by looking at the display on its HUD. Additionally, a warning sound is triggered when the missile is incoming. You will not have that problem when using the SRAW though. Since the Mbt Law does not have a bullet drop at all at this point in the game, hitting targets at those ranges, at least theoretically, is quite possible with that too. What may happen is that other pieces of equipment or empty vehicles are getting locked on by the Mbt Law and therefore not hitting your intended target. So, what are our personal favorite launchers what can we advise you to use and what kind of launchers are generally bad. In our opinion, the SRAW is the best and most versatile launchers of them all, having the broadest range of possible applications. Not only does it have the second highest damage profile of all launchers in Battlefield 4, but it also has the fastest reload time. If you want, you can always get a guaranteed hit on tanks with the SRAW, at the risk of exposing yourself for a certain amount of time though. Using the SRAW, you are quite effective up to ranges of 830 meters against slowly moving air or ground targets. On top of that, you can lock onto laser designated targets that are out of your line of sight. Therefore, the SRAW seems to be the best all-rounder. Moreover, the SRAW is really useful when you're passenger in a scout or transport heli. Since the SRAW doesn't have a bullet drop at all, you just quickly have to aim down sights at your target, fire your shot and then go back to hip fire again. The missile will fly in a flat trajectory towards your target, and that is quite effective. Of course, when you have good coordination with your pilot, you can do the same thing using a Javelin, but since helis are usually moving around so much, you might lose the line of sight to your target and therefore lose the lock-on, and therefore the Javelin is not as effective as the SRAW. Of course, at this point you can also use an Mbt Law, which of course being self-guiding will compensate for aim that is slightly off. So if you don't have the SRAW unlocked or you don't really get the hang of its controls, you can use the Mbt Law and get guaranteed hits from close range and even around corners. Here you have the disadvantage though that it only does 21 damage per shot and that it's not able to cause mobility hits. This gets compensated by the extremely high rate of fire of the Mbt Law. Reload time is only 2.8 seconds for it. In comparison to that, 5 seconds for both SMAW and RPG. So when using the Mbt Law, you might even on your own be able to take down an enemy tank extremely fast with the homing missile, making it very hard for the tank to defend himself against that. On top of that, you can use the Mbt Law against laser designated targets just like SRAW and Javelin can, and therefore is effective against target out of your line of sight too. At this point, we would like to mention that we don't really use the Mbt Law because we are simply too vain for that. Using missiles that have auto aim on it is simply not what we would like to have in a Battlefield game. Moreover, Mbt Law, Staff Shell and Active Radar, all those auto aim weapons are banned from all the leagues, so therefore it doesn't even make sense to get used to weapons like that are banned from every competitive league out there anyways. When fighting a tank at close to medium range, we would always advise you to use an RPG instead. 3 shots in the side armor or 2 shots in the back armor will simply destroy a tank. There is no alternative to that. As always, we would like you to thank you for tuning in. If you liked it, then please also check out our latest quick tip video talking about the advantages and disadvantages of the autoloader perk in BF4, and also to an absolutely astonishing trickshot video from DCS.